Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. The United States and South Korea are holding a combined military training this week. It is one of the two major drills the two countries conduct together each year. In recent years, the trainings have been significantly downsized. The joint military exercise returned this month after the cancellation of this year's spring exercise, which has fanned worries about allies' readiness. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining us is David Maxwell, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell was a planner for the United Nations Command and the Combined Forces Command. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It is widely reported in South Korea that this month's training is conducted through computer simulation. Mr. Maxwell, is this different from previous trainings? How is it comparable to the field training?
Well, this is a combined command post training event, and it is designed to train the commanders and staff at the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command and the subordinate components, air, land, sea, marine, and special operations. It is computer simulated because that is what is necessary to train the staffs and the commanders. There is no need for field training at the higher staff levels. And in fact, the computer simulation allows the commanders and staff to train to more complex events. And of course, it is all focused on defending South Korea from a North Korean attack. That is the primary purpose of this training, and the computer simulation allows the commanders and staff to see how North Korea will attack South Korea, and then they go through their intelligence, their planning, their execution, their logistics functions to successfully defend South Korea from a North Korean attack.
A large-scale joint military training has come back after skipping one earlier in the spring. It's been scaled down compared to past events due to the coronavirus, but it is still a large-scale drill. Mr. Snyder, how significant is the resumption of this training, both militarily and politically?
Well, it's very important from the perspective of the fact that COVID has made it impossible to conduct the spring exercises. And of course, in this context of having skipped exercises, the issue of making sure that readiness is at an appropriate level and that North Korea receives the deterrence message, it's important. We know that North Korea also has had problems, but out of problems opportunities can be generated. So it's always important to maintain a deterrence message for North Korea.
U.S. and South Korean officials usually explain the joint training is aimed at maintaining the robust defense posture. But pro-North Korean newspaper in Japan, Joseon Shinbo, criticized the training, saying it could spark a crisis or even a war in August. This kind of response from the North Korean side, it is something we expected going in, but Mr. Snyder, will this provide a reason for North Korea's further provocations?
I don't necessarily see the exercises as triggers for provocations on the North Korean side. Instead, they are opportunities for North Korea to voice public criticism of U.S. and South Korean policies. Usually, North Korean provocations or demonstrations of capability, I think, are driven more by North Korea's technical needs and by political factors.
Mm-hmm. A U.S. government official told VOA this training event will enable the U.S. and South Korea to pursue combined security training objectives, which are to maintain a credible combined security posture. Mr. Maxwell, what are the two allies expected to achieve from this month's exercise?
Well, first and foremost, it is a chance to practice the defense plans, again, against attack from North Korea. So there has been staff turnover in the summertime. And so this training allows the commanders and staff and all the subordinate components to understand the defense plans, how to optimize the capabilities of the combined military force to defend against North Korea. And again, it's important because it is really the PhD level of war to orchestrate all the theater instruments of power in the theater operating systems of intelligence and planning and logistics, whereas the field training is really maneuver forces. And one thing that North Korea should understand is that training takes place all year round. So our battalions, our air squadrons, our naval forces, our carrier battle groups conduct training all year round. But it is this combined command post training that must be conducted at least biannually to maintain the highest state of readiness, because they've got to be able to command and control all these complex military components.
Mm-hmm. Originally, this month's combined military training was thought to be partly aimed at assessing Seoul's capability to take operational control of Allied forces. However, a U.S. official told VOA later that the second stage of the assessment, which is a full operational capability test, would be impossible this month, largely due to the coronavirus. Mr. Maxwell, what should we make of this situation?
Well, we should remember that the OPCON transition is conditions-based. It requires certain conditions to be met. A reduction in North Korea's nuclear threat, integrated missile defense capability with South Korea and the U.S., development of independent warfighting command and control capabilities, and then a certification of the ability for the future Combined Forces Command to be able to execute the defense plans against North Korea. And so we've had the initial operating capability assessment. The issue is, since we did not conduct the major training in February and March, that we haven't allowed the Combined Forces Command to continue to train to develop those capabilities. And so the conditions are not optimal for conducting the full operational capability assessment. And so we will focus on readiness as we must. And then in the future, the commanders, Korean and U.S. commanders, will decide what is the right time to execute the fully operational capability assessment. Because, again, it is condition-based and not time-based, although everybody does focus on the big question of when will the OPCON transition occur.
Mr. Snyder, Mr. Maxwell just mentioned that the OPCON transition is condition-based, but South Korea aims to complete the OPCON transition by May 2022. Why the deadline?
Well, it really represents a political goal of the Moon administration to complete this OPCON transition before the end of President Moon's term. And I think that it really is related to the fact that President Moon was also in office when this issue first came up as Chief of Staff to Roh Moo-hyun. It was an objective that was not achieved in the Roh Moo-hyun administration. And so he may be driven by time factors because he doesn't want to see the possibility that this could be strung out in ways that would actually make it unfeasible in the context of a political transition in South Korea.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, will South Korea and the United States be able to meet this deadline? How has the OPCON transition progressed so far?
Well, it has progressed very well. And again, there is no deadline. It is conditions-based. And the fundamental question that has to be answered is, how does the ROK military and the U.S. military combine to form the optimal Combined Forces Command to be able to successfully execute all of its missions? First, to deter North Korean attack. Then, if North Korea chooses to attack, defeat the North Korean People's Army, and then achieve the political objectives for the alliance. So the question is not based on time, although what Mr. Snyder said is very correct. President Moon is on a timeline for all the reasons that he described. Really, the military professionals are first and foremost concerned with the security of the Republic of Korea and how to best organize and train our military forces so that they can be successful in any contingency that is caused by a North Korean attack or a North Korean instability situation, North Korean regime collapse, any situation that occurs on the Korean Peninsula, the future ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command must be ready to successfully execute.
I want to ask both of you, it seems like meeting the timeline for the transition is important for South Korea. But on the U.S. side, they want to make sure that all the conditions are met. Where should we put the priority then? Mr. Snyder, let me start with you.
Well, I think for this particular exercise, it's very clear that readiness has been the higher priority. And I think that that's probably based on the premise that conditions and certifications can be managed later, that we don't necessarily have a time deadline. But what I would say is that regardless of the time deadline that President Moon feels, or the conditions approach that is present in the military approach, we have seen great benefits, I think, in terms of building South Korean capabilities simply by going through this process. And what we've really been talking about so far is about certification of South Korean increased capabilities. But the other big condition that remains out there is whether or not North Korea's nuclear program is being contained. And so that, I think, is actually the wild card in this process, really we don't have a solution to in the context of no diplomatic process for moving North Korea toward denuclearization.
Mr. Maxwell?
Yes, well, I think it's not correct to describe, Korean and U.S. as on different sides. I think all the military professionals in the Korean military and the U.S. military professionals all understand the necessity of having a conditions-based OPCON transition. So it is not as if it's Korea versus the United States, certainly not within the Combined Forces Command and the military. But as noted, President Moon has his political desires. And so that's really what is driving the timeline. It is really important that the capabilities do be certified. And as Scott said, South Korea has been developing, really advanced military capabilities. And when you compare the capabilities that South Korea is developing with the terrible conditions of the North Korean People's Army, we can see that the South Korean military is far superior to North Korea. And really, North Korea's only advantage is surprise, its asymmetric capabilities, and its mass, being the fourth largest army in the world, positioned for offensive operations, which is the critical reason why we must conduct this training. Because North Korea is postured for offensive operations, the ROK-US Combined Forces Command must conduct training to ensure readiness.
Mm-hmm. Another important thing is how the OPCON transition will change the U.S.-North Korea relations or even the inter-Korean relations. Mr. Snyder, how will the OPCON transition be perceived by North Korea, and will the OPCON transition change the geopolitical dynamic in the region?
Well, I think that is a very interesting question. In some ways, it's the critical question, and I worry that North Korea really doesn't fully understand what the OPCON transition is about. And so on the one hand, they may see OPCON transition as an opportunity because they'll see South Korea playing a bigger role. And so that is a risk that is inherent in this process. But at the same time, I hope that the North Koreans also see that South Korea is playing a bigger role in terms of being able to conduct self-defense. And of course, on the conventional side, South Korea has some manifest advantages over North Korea. But the problem there is North Korea's reliance on its nuclear capabilities to counter their conventional vulnerabilities. And so that dynamic can also be exacerbated as North Korea focuses on trying to peel the U.S. and South Korea apart from each other by using its nuclear capabilities as a way of trying to threaten the U.S. In order to keep the U.S. Out, or trying to separate the U.S. from South Korea.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think what's important for North Korea to understand is the reason that we are conducting this OPCON transition is because of the trust and the great respect the U.S. military has in the South Korean military. This is a natural evolution of the alliance relationship, and it is really a partnered relationship. Whereas in the past, North Korea has always attacked the relationship as big brother, little brother. But with this OPCON transition, we are really demonstrating the equal partnership of the alliance relationship. And so that's why this OPCON transition can happen, why it must happen, and why it will be successful.
Mm-hmm. We'll have to see how North Korea reacts to this. and watch closely how the scaled-down exercise will affect the schedule for the OPCON transition. Mr. Maxwell and Mr. Snyder, thank you both very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis. Goodbye.